I remember the smell most of all. Not the usual stench of the river, mud, decay, stagnant water, but something worse, something wrong. It clung to the air that morning in March 1896 as I stood with Constable Harris on the bank of the Thames near Reading. The parcel had been spotted by a bargeman drifting just beneath the surface, snagged in reeds, a brown paper bundle, roughly tied with twine. It could have been anything, a butcher's waste, rags, refuse, but Harris's face had gone pale. When we hauled it in and laid it on the riverbank, the twine split easily under my knife. The paper peeled back, waterlogged and rotting. Inside was a child, a girl, perhaps 6 months old, wrapped in a faded baby dress, and around her neck a length of white tape, tied in a perfect bow. Strangled! I looked down at the lifeless child and felt something tighten in my chest. I'd seen murders before, men knifed in alleyways, wives beaten to death behind locked doors. But this was different. This wasn't rage. This was methodical, calculated, cold. Harris found the clue. Small, soaked, but legible. A label still clung to the wrapping paper. Mrs. Thomas, 26 Kensington Road, Reading. That was the moment the entire case shifted, from a grim recovery to something else. Something darker. I sent a telegram to headquarters. Child's body recovered. Possible address found. Request immediate support. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the chimneys of Reading, I stood before the door of number 26. It was a modest house. Tidy curtains, polished knocker, the sort of place you'd never look twice at. But evil has a way of hiding in plain sight. A woman answered. Middle-aged, severe face, thin lips. She called herself Amelia Dyer, claimed the parcel had nothing to do with her, that she let rooms, and perhaps a former tenant had used her name. Her tone was calm, almost rehearsed, but her eyes darted, calculating. We needed a warrant. As I left the house, I glanced back over my shoulder. The windows stared back at me like dark eyes in a skull. I had a feeling, no, a certainty, that this was only the beginning, that we'd found the first thread in a web far more terrible than we could imagine, and that the river had only given up one of its secrets. We returned to 26 Kensington Road 2 days later, this time with a signed warrant in my coat pocket and a quiet, unshakable tension sitting behind my ribs. Amelia Dyer was no longer there when we arrived. According to a neighbour, she'd left the evening before, saying she was visiting her daughter in Caversham. But I didn't believe she'd left in fear. She didn't seem like the type to panic. She'd left because she knew. She knew we'd found the package in the river, and she could feel the noose beginning to tighten. The house was still and strangely clean, but it had the kind of silence that presses down on a man's shoulders. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of things that had been hidden. We started upstairs. The front rooms were tidy, lace doilies, polished picture frames, everything just so. On the mantel above the hearth sat a faded photograph of a young girl, perhaps Amelia's daughter, and beside it a vase of artificial flowers, stiff with dust. I remember thinking how unnatural it all felt, like a stage set meant to distract us from what lay beneath. And what lay beneath was in the nursery. It was a small room, tucked at the end of the hall. The curtains were drawn, the air stale and heavy. There were no toys, no crib, no sound, only the faint smell of something sweet and spoiled, like milk gone sour, or worse. I felt it in my throat before I fully realized what it was. Constable Harris lifted one of the floorboards near the wall, and that's when we found the first bundle, It was wrapped in a worn baby blanket and pressed flat with time, as if it had been hidden and forgotten, or never meant to be remembered. Inside were tiny garments, a lace bonnet, a pair of soft shoes, a small hand-knitted cardigan. There were more. Dozens more. All folded, all packed away, some still marked with initials in fading thread. We found stains. Faint, but unmistakable. In the kitchen, beneath a stack of old newspapers and tins, we discovered a tin box filled with letters. These were not bills or receipts. They were written by women, most of them young, unmarried, desperate. Their words were trembling, pleading. They wrote of shame, of fear, of hope. They begged Miss Dyer to take their babies, to give them a better life, to keep them safe. Some enclosed a few coins, others offered jewelry, and nearly every letter ended with a promise to visit, though I don't believe a single one of them ever saw their child again. Folded between the letters was a list. At first glance, it looked like a simple ledger, dates, names, small amounts of money. But then I saw the final column. Red pencil, tally marks, crosses, numbers, no explanations. It wasn't a ledger, it was a record of endings. That night, I sat in the station reviewing every name, every line, every terrible piece of evidence we had collected. I could still smell that nursery on my coat. I could still see the booties, so small they fit in the palm of my hand. And I knew this was not the work of a desperate woman or a moment of madness. This was systematic, cold, practiced. We sent word to stations across the city. If Amelia Dyer thought she could disappear into the fog of London, she was wrong. Because we had seen her work, and we were going to find her. We found her 4 days later. She was renting a room in a modest house in Somerset Street, a few miles east of where the parcel had surfaced. She used a false name. Of course she did. And when we arrived, she was quietly folding laundry beside a fireplace, as if the city hadn't just erupted in horror over what she had done. There was no fear in her eyes when she saw us, only weariness, or perhaps boredom. "Mrs. Dyer," I said, even though I knew that name was now as hollow as her promises to the mothers who'd written to her. "You'll come with us?" She didn't protest. She didn't cry. She stood up, smoothed the front of her skirt, and said, "I expected as much." On the train ride back to Reading, she sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window. She didn't ask what we'd found. She didn't deny anything. I asked if she wanted to confess, and she smiled faintly. "There's no use pretending, is there?" Back at the station, we laid out the evidence. Letters, clothes, the list from the tin box, and photographs of the infant we had pulled from the river. She didn't flinch. But when I showed her the white ribbon tied around the baby's neck, the one still damp from the Thames, something in her face cracked. Not sorrow, not guilt, just a small shift, like a mask slipping for half a second. She said, "That was mine." I asked how many babies, how many names, how many rivers. She said nothing. Later that night, one of the younger constables found another package had been recovered upstream, identical to the first. Same wrapping, same twine, same white ribbon. Another child, a boy this time. We knew then that the river had more to tell us if we were willing to listen. The newspapers began to circle like vultures. The public wanted blood. Headlines screamed of "the ogress of reading" and "the angel of death." I hated those names. They sounded too grand for what she was, too mythical. Amelia Dyer was not a monster from folklore. She was a woman, a nurse, a mother. And that's what made it worse. She had perfected her cruelty. When we searched her belongings from Somerset Street, we found more letters, unsent replies to the mothers who had written her. Some were polite refusals. "I'm full. I'm sorry. I cannot take your child at this time." Others promised lies. "Yes, your little one is safe and happy. You're welcome to visit any time." One letter was addressed to a Miss Eva Carmichael. It was sealed, never posted. Inside, Amelia had written only one sentence. She never cried. Not once. I sat alone that evening in the station, the gaslight flickering over the paperwork that now filled an entire file drawer, labelled simply, "Dyer." I thought of the families who never knew what became of their children. I thought of the shame those mothers carried, and the trust they had placed in a stranger with kind eyes and a cruel heart. We had Amelia Dyer in custody, but the damage was already done, and the river, we feared, had not yet emptied itself of all her sins. The trial of Amelia Dyer began on the 22nd of May, 1896, at the Old Bailey. The courtroom was packed, journalists, grieving mothers, curious spectators, and those who simply wanted to look into the eyes of evil. Some came with hatred, others with morbid fascination. I sat quietly behind the prosecution, my notebook in hand, though I hardly wrote a word. I didn't need to. I already knew every detail by heart. Dyer was charged with one murder, that of Doris Marmon, the infant pulled from the Thames with the white tape tied around her neck. It was enough. We had the label, the handwriting, and most damning of all, her own admission. "That was mine," she had said when she saw the ribbon. She showed no emotion during the proceedings. She sat in the dock, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes drifting from the judge to the ceiling, never once meeting the eyes of the mothers who had come to see her face justice. She did not cry when Doris's mother took the stand. She did not flinch when the photographs were passed around the room. The prosecution read aloud one of the letters she had received, a desperate plea from a woman who could no longer care for her child, but wanted her to have a better life. I watched Dyer closely during the reading. Her face remained calm, as if she were listening to the weather report. Her defense attempted to plead insanity. They cited her previous stays in asylums, her melancholia, her supposed religious fervor. They said she'd been driven to it by poverty, by abandonment, by madness. But the jury didn't buy it. Nor did I. I had stood in her home, seen how she folded the baby clothes, how she marked her ledgers with red pencil. That wasn't madness, that was control. After barely 5 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty. She did not react. When asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, Amelia Dyer finally looked up. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, and she said, "I have nothing to say. May God have mercy on me." It was the first time she had mentioned God. She was hanged at Newgate Prison on June 10th, 1896. I did not attend. I had no appetite for the gallows. I had seen enough death. But I remember reading the account later, written by a prison guard. As she stepped onto the scaffold, she turned to the chaplain and whispered something. Just 3 words. I meant to. To this day, I don't know if that was a confession, a justification, or simply her final stamp of control. But those words stayed with me. In the weeks that followed, the Thames continued to give up its secrets. We found more remains, some too decomposed to identify, others still wrapped in the same brown paper and tied with the same white tape. We never discovered the full number. Some said it was over 200. Others believed it was more. the ledgers she left behind were incomplete. Some victims had no names at all, just a dash, a date, and a silence that stretched for over a century. I've long since retired from the force. I live quietly now, outside the city, where the nights are darker and quieter. But sometimes, when the wind picks up, I think of the river. I think of that first parcel, floating silently in the reeds. And I think of the babies who were never held, never named, never mourned. And I wonder how many more are still out there, sleeping beneath the surface, waiting to be remembered.